Now, any generalization is perilous when you're talking about the 4,352 colleges, universities, and junior colleges in the United States, but some generalizations seem clear. One is that a scissors has opened between state and private institutions. This is a change. It seems as if it's always been the case. In fact, when I began my career in the 1970s, many flagship state institutions had better research funding, paid better salaries, and offered better teaching conditions in many respects than their private rivals. And people who left Harvard or Columbia to go to the City University of New York or to Berkeley were fiercely criticized by their colleagues for selling out for higher salaries, something that's hard to imagine now. Now, however, the state sector, which educates 74% roughly of the students in America, is clearly in financial straits. The states themselves have decided that though they're going to go on calling you their state universities, they're not actually going to pay your budgets. Many flagship universities get 10% or less of their total income from the state. In New Hampshire's case, I understand it's about 14%. Endowments are small and scattered, and the ever-increasing expense of education at state universities must therefore be borne by students and their families. There's simply nobody else who's left to carry the burden. Raising taxes is a political third rail. It would be wonderful if we had a governor who could articulate in an eloquent way the reasons why it is bad to spend, as California does, 11% of its budget on prisons and 7.5% of its budget on higher education. But even though Arnold Schwarzenegger did say that, he didn't give a really powerful explanation of why that's a bad thing. So, at the moment, the whole financial substructure that supports public education is under tremendous stress. That's condition one. Condition two, which seems to me more novel, is the rise of a bitter and largely unfounded body of sentiment against public sector workers in the United States, which has grown up over the last 10 or 20 years and been blown up by certain kinds of political rhetoric. Now, there's an obvious economic cause for this. Private sector workers have not seen their incomes rise over the last 10 years. Public sector workers have, in some cases, had raises. They have benefits which are not going to be wiped away by losing their jobs. But whatever the reasons, the result is that there's a tremendous sense that public sector workers are underworked, overpaid, overprivileged, overprovided with benefits. And we all know this is not the case, I think, but we also all know that this rhetoric is out there. And that's another founding condition. A third founding condition that affects all of us is that we are depending more and more on adjunct and contingent faculty. The percentage of people teaching who were not on tenure or tenure track contracts in 1980 was 43, less than half the faculty. We're now over 70%. And that's a terrifying fact. Many adjunct and contingent professors do an extraordinary job teaching. I'm currently teaching Western Civ from Plato to NATO, a basic freshman course. And the sections are done by lecturers whom we hire for 3 years at a time. They're doing a wonderful job. They're very engaged. They work with me on every part of the course. They're exceptional teachers, and we're lucky to have them. In much of the world, though, the adjunct or contingent professor has to operate without a home base, without an office often, without full access to university libraries and other resources. Many of them teach at 2, 3, or more institutions at a time, since basic adjunct pay is so low that you may need to teach 5 or 6 courses a semester in order to make enough money to starve. That has definitely weakened the fabric of American higher education in ways that we have been reluctant to face. And I think it's in the light of all of these that we can look at the absolutely terrible state of American higher education as a whole. Nancy Fulby, in a recent book called Saving State U, compares the stream of students going into education in America to Napoleon's army entering Russia in 1812. 100 students come to 9th grade. 69 of them graduate in 4 years, so the high school is already a dire problem. 39 of those enter college. That's not a number to pride ourselves on. 27 of those 39 make it back for sophomore year. 18 will earn a BA within 6 years or an AA within 3 years at community college. So that's the general background within which we're receiving some fairly ferocious criticism, and it's a general background which it seems to me explains why the university has some informed and sharp critics. This is the situation in which we live and in which we work. Nonetheless, I don't think these facts justify the wider sense that has clearly spread among governing elites, both nationally and at the state level and locally, which seems to me to hold that where 50 years ago in America we had the ideals of the GI Bill, which then extended themselves, as liberal ideals will, to others not touched by the GI Bill, to more women, to more people of color. Where in the 1960s, somewhat later, the British came up with a similar program of opening tertiary education to more and more able people after keeping them out for centuries. We now have the idea that we simply can't afford to pay for campus study for young people for 4 years here or 3 years in Britain. In place of leading the world in numbers of university graduates, we have resigned ourselves to taking place number 10 after not only most of Europe, but also South Korea. In place of using education as a tool for social mobility to allow people to move up from the places where they're born, we have allowed higher education to become more and more stratified to the point where we are at the bottom of advanced nations for social mobility. You are less likely, if you're born into the lowest income quartile of the American people, to move up than you would be if you were born in that quartile in Germany, in Spain, even in Britain, which we've always thought of as the much more haughty and hierarchical society that we came away from. Within this frightening situation, the humanities are, it seems to me, in a bleak rhetorical position. There are pragmatists who would like to rid the universities entirely of such studies, or would like at least to rid the public sector of any necessity to pay for them. And we've seen this happen in Britain in the last few weeks. In Britain, in the last few weeks, universities have been told that they are going to lose the entire amount of their budget, which was provided by the state for teaching in humanities and social sciences. So all humanities and social science teaching will have to be supported by student tuition payments, which in turn are meant to be borrowed by students and paid back by a later graduate tax. But what this means is, if you're studying medicine, the state will pay for your education. If you're studying the humanities, you are doing something of no social value, the state will only help you by giving you a cheap loan. And as soon as you're making over a rather low amount of money, I think it's £21,000, which is around $32,000, you'll get to start paying off those debts, which will be quite substantial. There are pragmatists who argue that the humanities are genuinely a complete waste of time, and that you would be much better off not being here at all, but being at, say, the University of Phoenix or DeVry, where you could be learning the skills you would use in an office, maybe even in the office, to run accounting systems or control inventory or do the other work of the world. And then there are the critics who say that the humanities should stay, should deserve their place, that they do something valuable, but not the way they're currently conducted. So that is our larger rhetorical situation. Below the rhetoric, there are some terrible structural problems, and I'm just going to go through 3 of them in, I think, increasing order of seriousness. But even the first is very serious. The first is that graduate education in the humanities has become a catastrophe. We've only started in the last 20 years to collect actual data about graduate education. That itself is an indictment of us and the way we run our profession. It takes 9.3 years for the average humanist to get a PhD. But the average humanist is not just in school, she takes time off. So it actually takes 11.3 years for the average humanist to leave to get a PhD. That means that you get your PhD if you start right after your BA in your early 30s. The attrition is well over 50% in humanities PhD programs. And of those who succeed in finishing, well under 50% will actually achieve a tenure-track teaching position at a college, a university, or a community college. So we are, in fact, devouring our young. That is a fact and needs to be attended to. Secondly, we've been completely unsuccessful at convincing the governors of our society or the wider society itself that we have some elementary practical skills that they could use. And I'll just use one example from my own circle of acquaintance. I apologize since I've criticized the people I'm criticizing for doing this, but it's a good example, I think, to bring this home. My son's best friend, after finishing Princeton, joined the Army and spent 18 months as an infantryman in the Sunni Triangle. He repeatedly found himself in the position of standing outside a household's door in the middle of the night, cradling a saw, a squad automatic weapon, an automatic weapon which can basically take down a masonry house in 30 seconds, while one of his companions broke down the door, and none of them were able to explain why they were doing what they were doing because their interpreter didn't speak Iraqi Arabic, as they discovered once the door was broken down and people began to scream. Imagine, if you will, being in my son's friend's position of going into a bedroom in such a house and seeing one of the inhabitants holding an AK-47 and not being able to ask about his intentions. Happily, that was negotiated peacefully. But it seems to me, if we are at war in two areas where the need for foreign language skills is absolutely massive, and there's far less understanding today than there was in the government 40 years ago of the need for language study, that's a dire position. We have not made clear, even where we are teaching the most basically practical, vital skills that are of essential importance to our country, that that is the case. And finally, in some ways, it seems to me the hardest of all these problems, we have found it impossible to construct a cogent, powerful set of arguments that would convince administrators, that would convince regents and trustees, that would convince the wider public, that would convince those who govern our country that the humanities are vital. I don't know quite why this is the case, but let me go over some of the arguments that don't work. One set of arguments that clearly doesn't work is the argument that the humanities equip you better than other studies for thinking about questions of justice, citizenship, right and wrong. I'm not taking a position on this. I'm just saying this is not an argument that you can make now with any chance of anybody believing it, as the great philosopher Martha Nussbaum found when she tried to make that argument in a powerful book. One reason for this is that it's empirically not true that humanists are more civic than other people. At Princeton, the most civic students I know are the civil engineers who spend every summer building clean water systems in Africa for small villages. Hard to beat that for civic dedication, and you don't see many English majors there.